Hi there, and welcome to our first video on the Permian mass extinction. So we'll first start by examining possible causes for this extinction, and then in later videos you'll learn about the underlying trigger for this biological crisis, and then finally about some of the consequences from this extinction. But first, what are mass extinctions? So, well, new species are always evolving, and species are always dying off or going extinct, but usually at fairly low and sort of stable rates. And we call these background extinctions. However, there have been times in the past when really huge numbers of species go extinct over a geologically fairly short period of time. And traditionally there are 5 mass extinctions called the Big Five. But of these, the end Permian mass extinction, sometimes also called the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, which occurred about 250 million years ago, was the largest, and so that's what we're gonna focus on for this class. So what factors might have been responsible for the extinction of so many species? We'll focus on the extinction of marine organisms, but there was also an extinction of land plants and land animals. But in the ocean, a variety of so-called kill mechanisms have been proposed over the years, including things like sea level fall, which would reduce the area of shallow marine habitats for animals to live in, perhaps a meteorite or asteroid impact, maybe low oxygen levels, which is called anoxia, ocean warming, maybe ocean acidification. So given all of these possible things, which of them are potentially likely contributing factors? Can we rule any of them out? What does the evidence suggest? Well, sea level fall was one of the early causes proposed for the extinction, going back more than 50 years, kind of in large part, not entirely, but in large part because there are almost no rocks from the late Permian in North America. And so that's the plot shows here. It just shows sort of a measure of the amount of rock, the abundance of sedimentary rocks in North America. And I've marked with the red arrow there this very sharp decrease. It's a short decrease, but very sharp and short decrease in the latest Permian. So a lack of sedimentary rock could suggest that the sea level fell, because then the ocean wouldn't cover up as much as the continent as it did before. However, it turns out that North America isn't actually typical for this time period, and actually there's also probably more late Permian rock in North America than we previously thought. Because in other places, the extinction seems to have occurred during sea level rise rather than sea level fall. And this is true for most places, it seems. One of the best sites for studying the Permian extinction is a site called Meishan, which is in eastern China. So the photo here shows Permian and Triassic rock layers at Meishan, including, so we had the layers where the extinction occurred, in this sort of red interval here. And yes, sea level was falling, a little bit during the latest Permian. The rock layers suggest that we're getting a slightly shallower environment in the ocean. But sea level rise actually started a little bit before the extinction, and the extinction occurred during that rising sea level. It can also be informative to look at sort of how quickly the extinction occurred. And so here's how we can do that. You've heard a little bit about this type of thing before. So I'll just walk through this. So let's say there's a layer of sediment that forms on the ocean floor, and then a volcanic eruption occurs, depositing a layer of volcanic ash into the ocean. And as you heard in a previous video, there are typically minerals called zircon in these volcanic ashes, and zircons contain trace elements of radioactive uranium, which decays into the element lead at a known rate. And so measurements of uranium and lead can be used to get an age, and indicates that this particular volcanic eruption occurred 251,941,000 years ago, plus or minus 37,000 years. So after that, some more sediment layers were deposited on the ocean floor, and then some more sediment layers after that, and some more sediment layers now marking the end of the Permian period and the beginning of the Triassic period. And then there was another volcanic eruption. And this one is dated to 251,880,000 years ago, give or take 31,000 years. And then if we look at the extinction, it occurred more or less during this sort of span of rock layers. It wasn't sort of an instantaneous thing. It sort of started just below the first ash layer, and that was the peak of it, and sort of tailed off into the Triassic period. So, given the dates, even with the sort of the uncertainties, it seems like the extinction probably happened over a period of roughly 60,000 years or so. Well, sea level during this time period at least is something that changes over hundreds of thousands or million years or more. So it seems that the extinction was much faster. It seems like if sea level was falling slowly, the extinction probably shouldn't be as fast. So sea level fall is not really thought to be an important driver of the extinction anymore. So let's look at evidence for an asteroid impact. Well, so in the early 2000s, some groups of researchers claimed to have found these sort of peculiar complex carbon molecules called fullerenes. They're kind of like cages of carbon molecules, like soccer balls and things like that. And so they said they found fullerenes in rocks from the Permian Extinction interval in Japan, from deep water sediments. Now fullerenes can be produced during high energy asteroid impacts, but they can also be produced in a variety of other high energy ways, such as the heat from forest fires. But in this case, the researchers found these fullerenes associated with a particular isotope or type of helium gas, helium-3, that's common in extraterrestrial material such as asteroids, but extremely rare on Earth. So together, these things maybe suggest that there was an asteroid impact around this time, bringing these materials to Earth. But wait, it turns out, within a couple years, some other research groups were unable to repeat these results. They analyzed samples and they did not find a peak in fullerenes or in helium-3. In fact, some researchers analyzed some of the exact same samples as in the first study. So it seems possible that the original discovery may have been laboratory contamination or something other accidental thing as opposed to a real signal. Well, another study argued that they discovered the actual crater from the asteroid impact, buried deeply under ocean sediment in the Indian Ocean off of Western Australia. And they used a variety of lines of evidence, such as sort of melted minerals, this thing called mescalinite, which is just sort of a particularly sort of melted mineral, as well as crystals that had high pressure shock features that you would expect from an asteroid hitting the Earth really quickly, pushing these shock waves through the rocks. They also argued for glass fragments that formed by the rapid cooling of rock that was melted by the energy of the impact. And so glass, kind of like your window glass, but in geological terms, glass is just a substance that doesn't have the regular arrangement of atoms in a crystal structure that you find in minerals. So they also measured the amount of argon gas produced by radioactive potassium. This is a different way of getting ages on these old rocks. And they dated the crater or these rocks to about 250 million years ago, overlapping in time with the Permian extinction. Well, this study ended up being pretty immediately very controversial. Multiple independent research groups all wrote replies to the scientific journal to try and argue against this. So it was sort of immediately got a lot of response and a lot of sort of quite negative response, it turned out. Because these other researchers felt that there was really no evidence for shock features in these crystals, and these sort of partially melted minerals was also, they didn't think it was very convincing. They also felt that the glass fragments, didn't seem like they were very obviously from impact. They could have just been from volcanoes. Volcanoes do produce glass pieces when the volcanic melted rock cools quickly. there were some, let's just say, very strong opinions about the reliability of this age date, in terms of whether it really, what it really tells us about the age. So, these asteroid impact ideas have often prompted a lot of initial excitement, but over time, this sort of impact hypothesis seems like it sort of has failed to gain a lot of support for causing the Permian extinction. Okay, well, let's look at some other potential factors. So let's look at oxygen levels. One line of evidence comes from these things called Pyrite framboids. And you've heard about Pyrite before, a number of times before. So framboids are just tiny, like raspberry-shaped aggregates of Pyrite crystals. And as you've heard before in this class, Pyrite only forms when oxygen is absent. But somewhat counterintuitively, low oxygen conditions are indicated when the Pyrite framboids are small. That's kind of weird, right? Like if Pyrite forms when there's low oxygen, why are the framboids small? So why does small size indicate anoxia? Well, normally the seawater contains oxygen, but there is a layer somewhere within the sediment where there's a transition from oxygen-containing sediments to ones where there's no oxygen, or where it's anoxic. So the Pyrite framboids will grow in that zone, and they can get quite big because they're just sitting there in the sediment. They can grow for a long time and get to be relatively large. And by relatively large, we're talking, a few tenths of a millimeter or hundredths of a millimeter. They're very small still. However, when the anoxic layer is in the seawater, Pyrite framboids will still grow there. They grow at this sort of boundary, but because Pyrite is heavy, they instead will sink fairly quickly to the seafloor and stop growing before they can become big. So that's why small framboid size indicates that the water was anoxic. Larger framboids indicate that there was anoxic conditions in the sediment, which is a normal condition. So if we look at the Permian extinction, many places, such as these rocks from Svalbard here in Arctic Norway, contain rock layers that have only small framboids, indicating basically oxygen-free or anoxic conditions. Other layers contain many small framboids, but also larger ones that are 10, 20 microns, 25 microns in size. So that indicates that the oxygen levels were probably low to get framboids, but the oxygen was not absent. So scientists can also use biomarkers to determine environmental conditions. Now, you've previously heard in a number of times about biomarkers being used as a way to answer evolutionary questions, whether a group had evolved by a certain point. But they can also provide clues about the environment if we can find evidence for bacteria that require particular types of environmental conditions. So, for example, this biomarker, this complicated molecule called isorenieretane, and it's produced by a type of bacteria called green sulfur bacteria that require both sunlight as well as hydrogen sulfide in the water. Now, that's a really unusual combination because hydrogen sulfide doesn't occur with oxygen. And normally, shallow seawater where you have sunlight has lots of oxygen. So this must mean that there were places in the world during the Permian extinction where there was shallow water with sunlight, but also with no oxygen, so that hydrogen sulfide could build up. Well, this biomarker has now been found during the Permian extinction at multiple locations around the world, so it seems like there's a pretty, it was a pretty widespread, although not global, but pretty widespread phenomenon. However, this biomarker has also been found in rocks that formed well before the extinction, sort of during normal background or non-extinction times at some of these places. So it's less clear whether the low oxygen levels were necessarily a cause of the extinction, because if they were around before without any extinction, how important could they be? But regardless, there's a lot of evidence for low oxygen conditions, during the extinction. And in the past decade or so, there's also been increasingly strong evidence that the oceans warmed up. And this evidence comes from oxygen isotopes, as the two different types, oxygen 18 and oxygen 16, change as a function of temperature. And for time, I'm not going to go into the details about why this is. We might cover it later in the class. Now, oxygen isotope measurements have been challenging for the Permian because the original chemistry of the material is often altered after it formed. And so reliable measurements have really only come recently with the use of these tiny tooth-like elements from a type of fish called conodonts. And these measurements indicate that the ocean warmed up by about 8 to 10 degrees Celsius during the extinction, which is really, over the span of maybe only, 50,000 years, which is really a dramatic increase in temperature. And finally, a different geochemical measurement using isotopes of the element boron suggests that the pH of the surface ocean, how acidic it was, that the surface ocean became about 0.5 units more acidic. And again, for time I won't get into the way boron isotopes work, which is fairly complicated, but it's interesting to note that the change in boron isotopes, meaning that the pH got more acidic, largely parallels the change in oxygen isotopes, which measure temperature, which indicate the oceans got warmer. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the potential factors here. Which of these do you think might be more important or might be important as a contributor? Are there any we can more or less rule out? Well, it seems that perhaps a few factors contributed together to this extinction, and in the next video, we'll talk about sort of the underlying process that triggered all these environmental changes. So that's all for now, and thanks for listening.